Hello, everybody. It's great to be back this week. We're looking forward to a great conversation today on aircraft upset prevention and recovery training, and just have a great group of experts here with me today that we're going to introduce. And the idea today is to have just a nice conversation to really talk about the different areas and advantages of on-aircraft upset training, some of the limitations as well. We're going to talk to that and just have a good round of conversation together. So let me go ahead and introduce Randy Brooks. He's our VP training here at Aviation Performance Solutions. And he's probably not going to want all these bullets, but I found a whole bunch more on him in his bio online that we don't normally talk about. But Randy has 35 years of professional aerobatic instructional experience, CFI, MEI, CFI glider instructor, 3-time master CFI. He was also the leader of the training analysis team for ICATI, which was a Royal Aeronautical Society group or working group that worked on the prevention of upset or loss of control in flight for a number of years. He was also the manager of emergency situation training at Eclipse on the L-39, teaching upset training there, over 13,000 hours, multiple jet and turboprop ratings. He has a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering and was inducted to the Airshow Hall of Fame in 2015. So Randy, it's great to have you here. And I also note that you had over 500 surface level aerobatic experiences and demos, so you can certainly say that you've seen your share of all attitude flight.
BJ, I'm tired just from listening to my resume, but it's almost as impressive as our next panelist, Nick Outback Treglia. Nick is a naval aviator who's flown a lot of different things. He started out in rotary wing flying the mighty H-46 Sea Knight, transitioned from that to his first all-attitude instruction in the T-34 Charlie out of Pensacola, and I think that's where Nick probably got his first view of what we're going to be talking about today, about how important it is to get on aircraft experience, all-attitude experience. He then went on to fly C-130s for the Navy, and who even knew that the Navy flew C-130s, but Outback did that. And for the last many years, he's been teaching U.S. Army aviators using all of that combined experience in earlier in Bonanzas, Linz 182s, C-12s, and now flying the mighty Grobe 120 turboprop and using C-12 simulators there. Plus, like all of our panelists, he's just a great, fun guy to work with. Outback, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, and you are too kind. Looking forward to a good discussion.
Awesome. Great. Thanks, Outback. Thanks, Randy. And in our bottom corner, we have Dr. Janine Kosha. And Janine and APS and our team have been working together for a long, long time. In fact, we're just reminiscing. It was well over 10 years, I believe. Janine, she has a PhD in Applied Experimental and Human Factor Psychology from the University of Central Florida, Master of Science in Industrial and Systems Engineering from Ohio State, and then had a BA in Pre-Medicine and Psychology, which I didn't know until today. That's pretty cool. And then former Boeing 767 captain and human factors instructor at a major air carrier. She's also a flight instructor, designated flight examiner, and she's also an adjunct assistant professor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University worldwide. So Janine, great to have you here with us today. Tell us about the home. Do you still have the airplanes out back in your hangar, or what's going on with your collection of airplanes?
They are back there, and I just got in from the decathlon, so I've got Hair by David Clark. Oh, I'm sorry, Hair by another manufacturer. It used to be Hair by David Clark, and so they're there, and have a T-34 Bravo out there. Not nearly as fun as the Charlie, I'm sure, out back, but maybe someday I'll get in that Charlie as well.
You will.
Awesome. Great. Well, Randy, how do you want to get started here today?
Well, let's remind everybody what our topic is, and we want to talk about, of all of the different factors that we use in teaching upset prevention and recovery training, there's one that is head and shoulders above the rest, the most important, and that's on aircraft training. And as we were getting started for this, BJ and I were reminiscing about some testimony that we provided at ICAO headquarters in Montreal as part of the loss of control, avoidance, and recovery training aviation rulemaking, or LOC-I ARC. And, you know, they had looked at the different things that we had put together as part of ICATI, which was a Royal Aeronautical Society group devoted to identifying ways of combating loss of control in flight. And they'd kind of given everything equal measure. And BJ and I asked for time to come back and say, no, they're not all just equal checks in boxes. The on-aircraft component is by and large the biggest single factor for a lot of reasons that we're going to expose in some of the slides that I think you've prepared, BJ.
All right. Yeah, you bet. Why don't we just go on here? So the title of this is Why On-Aircraft Upset Training is King. Now, there's queens and princesses and princes and everything else, so don't get me wrong. There's more to the royal family than just on-aircraft training. But we're going to talk about why it really is an essential part of a solution. So let's go ahead and just go on here to the next page. Randy, why don't you talk a little bit, if you don't mind, or maybe you and Outback, a little bit on the EPIC S2 concept and why it matters to pilots everywhere.
Sure. So the EPIC S2 stands for Every Pilot in Control Solution Standard. And what we've done is identified the things that we need to use to provide comprehensive upset training. Now you can see 5 numbered slices of pizza there, and they're in their interlocking model, which shows that they reinforce one another. But there's kind of a 6th criteria, and that's the inner and outer rings of initial training, which needs to be robust and long enough to give people the practice that they need, and then recurrent training that follows on. So the first one is elite instructors, and we think that it should be obvious to everybody that a pilot, an instructor, has to know their subject. The next one is a term that not everybody knows. Outback, do you want to tell people what we mean when we say integrated training? What are we talking about at APS when we use that term?
Well, the integrated training, and I think we're coming really to the fundamentals of a robust experience and exposure to on-aircraft upset prevention and recovery training to really get those skills. And we can talk about flying and we can talk about recoveries, but till we actually get out on aircraft, it really, you can't learn it without that. And then later, getting some more reinforcing academics and taking that skill set and advancing that in a flight training simulation device.
So yeah, by combining those 3 assets, we get the most. Training intensity is a little bit less familiar to everybody, and that's talking about two things really. One is compressing a certain amount of training in a period of time so that you get that reinforcement that Outback just mentioned. And the second part, I think, speaks to what we're going to talk about today, is the intensity of the experience, to make sure that pilots really are prepared to deal with the human factors that they have in flight. The best practices compliant factor is based on just using the available information that's out there. And because UPRT is a rather new subject, there's a lot of people that aren't even aware of the amount of information that's been done. Purpose-built platforms is about using the right tool for the job. And in this case, it means aerobatic aircraft. And we'll talk about why that's important as we talk about the on-aircraft training component.
All right, great. Thanks, Randy. So what I'm going to talk about here just a little bit is what we call the quantitative loss of control and flight mitigation criteria. And if you just take a look at it, don't worry too much about what's on the right, but on the left side, what we found over 3 decades of teaching upset prevention and recovery training is that not all programs are the same, not all training platforms are the same, and not all instructors are equally capable of teaching certain areas. And so what we've determined after 3 decades of implementing UPRT, upset prevention recovery training solutions, is we've lined up what the key factors are to truly mitigate the threat in a traditionally trained pilot. And you can see that human factors tops the list, and you can see at the bottom, representative control, feel, and responses are important, but for example, they're not at the top of the list. So what we're going to talk about today is going to be how does an on-aircraft platform actually effectively address these critical factors or other factors we decide to talk about today that seem relevant to our discussion. So why don't we go ahead and just jump into that discussion, everybody, on the mitigating value really of these different factors and these different tools that we have available to us. And let's particularly talk about on-aircraft platforms. So Janine, what are your thoughts when you think about on-aircraft upset prevention and recovery training? I'm just pulling up our list of the factors on the right just as a reminder if we need them.
Well, we can go right to number 1 there, and my favorite topic as far as human factors are concerned, because how a how a pilot's brain works, operates, performs is different under certain types of under stress than it is when there is less or no stress. And regardless of what training platform you're using, you're going to have different levels of stress. And even if we're in a simulator, there's going to be stress about learning what the recovery is and trying to effect it appropriately. However, now we put you in flight in an aircraft, and we're teaching you something that you have not experienced before. Right there is to a normal human brain would be a threatening situation, where as soon as we add those stressors to the mix, our brain is going to function differently. It doesn't mean it's going to not function. It doesn't mean that it's not going to be able to learn and accommodate all of the factors that are associated with flying. And even if we're not doing upset training, just the difference of being on the ground in a flight simulator and being in the airplane, we have all of the physiological stressors of noise, temperature, oxygen deprivation. We could go on and on. And to neglect that part of a training program would be remiss. We can only do so much on the ground when we're talking about flying airplanes. And so there's the human factors part, I think, is what stands out in my mind mostly, that pilots are learning about when they're in the aircraft versus any other training environment.
So one more question for you, Janine. I'm just going to advance the slide here a little bit. Pull up some pictures of some airplanes that are on aircraft platforms, but under the human factors there, a confusing term or set of terms often is startle, surprise, fear. Can you maybe talk a little bit about just startle and surprise, at least to give us an idea of what that's referencing when it comes to human factors?
So startle, surprise, fear / anxiety / neural pathways of decision making all kind of go in a continuum, if you would. And whatever the situation is, the event that occurs may or may not effect a startle response, which is a physiological response and doesn't last very long. However, it could just be a surprising event. It might be even an upset that has been coming on for a number of minutes, and now I might not be startled, but I'm going to be surprised. And that emotion, if you will, once again affects how our neural pathways work to be able to make decisions, to perform psychomotor coordination and all those sorts of things, easy for me to say. So startle and surprise can also be mitigated and will diminish with more exposure to unexpected or novel or surprising events. And we can just jump right to that. If we see different events occur, even though something happens later on in the aircraft that is not a training aircraft, it might not be exactly the same event, but there has been some learning that has occurred, and the ability to react to that startle, surprise, stress, fear, anxiety has been improved.
Well, Randy, what about habituation? Is that something you can talk to a little bit? I'm putting you on the spot for a second there.
That's okay. The way this works, BJ, is that when we first see these things, there's the first time that we experience something new, no matter what it is, the brain is programmed to treat it as a threat because it's unfamiliar. And so while everything that Janine said earlier about the difference between simulators and aircraft is true regarding any type of flight training, it's just a little bit more so, a little bit more severe in the case of upset prevention recovery training or loss of control in flight situations, because what's happening is much stranger, much more unusual, much less familiar And so the body's going to see that as a threat. And also some of the physiological stresses, the presence of G, maybe high speed, maybe pointed at the ground, are more severe as well. And so when we first see that, it doesn't make us better at all. It makes us worse. But if the brain sees that again and again and again, then it learns to accommodate that. So I'll put that in perspective to the flying that we do. Is on our second flight, we introduced pilots to slipping and skidding stalls. Now, we've given them the academic background for that. We've shown them videos of what it's going to look like. So there's no surprise, to use Janine's term, in the sense that they know the airplane is going to do an uncommanded roll-off, and yet the first time it happens to them, they are really startled, okay? Because now they're feeling it. Now it's the world rotating about them. Now, the first time, we do that as a demonstration, and we show the pilots how to correct for that. The very second time they do it is a recovery that they're doing themselves, and the degree of startle is much, much less. And it gets less and less and less with the more practice they do, until eventually they can accommodate that uncommanded roll-off and a whole lot of other situations that they could not when they came to train with us. And so it's very rewarding as an instructor to see our students progress over a very short period of time, 4 flights over 2.5 days, to be able to, through the process of habituation, be able to accommodate those things that were relatively incapacitating for them the first time that they saw them.
I can see I'm peeking underneath our logo here. There you can see me up there. But I think our ultimate goal there, Randy, is ultimately a condition of overlearning, and it takes a certain amount of time for that to happen, and it's really a challenge to get them to that level. But it's almost like a human psychophysiological process. It's you can run a timer on the number of days, number of flights, number of hours it takes for 98% of people to really become conditioned to the point of overlearning, where they truly have a resilient skill set. Outback, what would you like to add to that conversation, or if you want to move on to another point, what would you like to say to that?
I think all these were very great points, and I've got a very fortunate position where I can actually see our very low time pilots in a very short time have that overlearning to where they can accommodate in the aircraft some pretty sporty, unusual attitudes and upsets. And then we take that into the simulator, and a very low time pilot could be 135 degrees angle of bank, 15 degrees nose down, and they get a certain confidence level where in their mind you can just hear them, I hope I get this perfect, where I could take an untrained instructor pilot in the same situation and he'd be like, I hope we live. So in a very, very short time, we see a lot of progress in that. And it is that exposure, it's that habituation, and the overlearning.
That's awesome. That's great. Anybody else want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I have one additional thought, BJ, and it's that, for a lot of people that aren't familiar with upset prevention recovery training and may equate it to aerobatics, they're thinking that this is about maneuvering, and that's certainly a part of it. There are skills that we need to learn. There's orientation, those aspects. But I think that an effective upset prevention recovery training program has to take these psychological factors, these cognitive impacts that we see in the face of surprise and startle, and provide pilots with the tools they need to combat that. Because if we don't, and we just have some sort of academic solution or some sort of maneuvers that don't take into account how the pilot's brain is going to work, as Janine was talking about earlier, into effect, then it's going to be great in a training environment, but it's not going to be useful in an emergency. So we got to make sure that it's really going to be there when it's needed.
Love it. Good conversation here. This is great. Go ahead, Janine.
BJ, I want to speak to Nick's point as far as the difference between I hope we're going to live and I hope I'll get this perfect. Because I think one of the qualities that comes from this type of training is in enhancing the pilot's self-efficacy and self-confidence for the skill set at hand. And as a researcher, I'm sitting here designing yet another research study because we already gathered data on self-efficacy of pilots when we look at some of our research studies. But just to go into an event and have that feeling that I hope I do it perfectly, there's no doubt in their mind they're going to recover. Is this going to be a really good one? Is it going to be spot on? And that right there, and you talk about your low time pilots. I feel sort of like it's easier to teach children than adults. It's easier to teach the lower time new pilots that we don't have to untrain all of the fears and anxiety and things that they have heard. I still have colleagues that have been flying for decades and decades that have never been upside down in an airplane and see absolutely no use in doing so. Right. So I think that's really an outstanding observation, Nick, that you've shared with us.
Thank you.
Well, the one thing that I've found, and it's always hard to say, but is that when we see pilots coming in with a lot of flight time, and it's not personal, it's not them, it's the training system, is that they really arrive unconsciously incompetent. And by the time they get through the program, they become consciously competent. And it's really exciting to see that they didn't realize, A, how important the training was, but also, B, how much risk they were facing just simply by having a lack of preparation through the traditional certification and licensing process of pilots. Okay, let's jump back to our slides because I see that time is ticking away here. We had the next one up there, Randy, applied theory laboratory, then motion cueing. Anything in there you wanted to talk to at all?
Yeah, we've beat up the human factors aspect pretty well, but for professional pilots, they're generally training in the simulator environment, and that is the next limitation of simulators is the aero model, that they cannot encompass all of the aerodynamics that we could have in flight. Now, some of the viewers might be aware that the U.S. airlines have had to modify their simulators to give them an expanded and enhanced aero model envelope, but they still fall short of the dynamic situations that can be encountered in an upset. And so, you're never going to have sustained Gs. You're never going to have the ability to practice unloading to less than 1 G in the simulator environment. And so that's one of the reasons that these deficiencies in the training system that you just talked about are invisible, is because we can't see what we can't see in the simulator in many cases.
Nick, you wanted to comment on that? I can see you nodding your head.
Well, we just see it with the students who progress onto the simulator. And it's surprising because while you can't feel the G, and the discussion there could take an hour, and just talking about that being our proxy for angle of attack, and angle of attack awareness, something you can't see by looking outside, but you can be trained to feel, where the students don't have that going to the simulator. But if we give them the on-aircraft experience, it's amazing because we do have a little G meter, what it would be in the aircraft simulator, and very close to what we hope they would achieve in the simulator they get. And that's really just from their awareness of how things would look.
You really can dramatically improve the training experience in a simulator by having locally in a time frame, locally placed on aircraft training before that session happens. So when we were wondering where to put simulation, gosh, a long time ago, almost 15 years ago now, when we first did it, we weren't sure whether to do simulation first or second, and it was absolutely certain after we tested it that the on-aircraft training comes first and the simulator session comes next. And what we had found was, to the point of this particular presentation here today, is that when we train people in the simulator with the same academic training program, the same time, same repetition proficiency, same situations, same skill sets, you put them in the real airplane and they're psychophysiologically incapacitated to take action in the first flight or two until they get that habituation to that high fidelity startle, surprise, fear environment, to have the resilience to be able to break through and get access to their skill sets. So without question, the on-aircraft training comes first because there is no such barrier when you do on-aircraft first, then go to the simulator. It's a perfect transformation or transfer of skills into the next level of implementation for UPRT. All right. Janine, what do you want to add to that?
I'm just going to add again to Nick's comment. We did run a study where we were on aircraft first and had a G meter in the full flight simulators, and it was amazing that the pilots could, they could still unload to a half G. If we did it the other way around, it took a while in the simulator to be able to figure out exactly how to make that happen. So I certainly can agree with the value of, get at least some on aircraft experience, and then you can do a lot more in the simulator.
And I'd like to use an anecdote to kind of reinforce what Janine just said, is that we were comparing notes with the FAA that does upset prevention recovery training in a 737 simulator that they have at the FAA Academy in Oklahoma City. And they were concerned. They had a number of people that were pushing to negative G. And, I've now trained about 50 airline instructors for the airlines that we work with, Delta and United. And we rarely saw over pushing to negative G in the simulator. But the reason is that all of those 50 instructors, as part of our Train the Trainer program, had flown with us on the aircraft first, and therefore carried that experience. And they didn't want to try and generate, negative G. They knew it would throw passengers out of their seats. But for the folks that have trained, singularly in the simulator environment, they don't have that experience to inform them to fall back on. So it just shows the value of the on-aircraft training.
All right. Well, as we approach wrapping it up here, one of the last points is manual flight operation proficiency. And so there's a marked difference between manual handling proficiency and manual flight operation proficiency. The latter really is the cognitive aspects of handling, thinking, managing an aircraft in an operational environment, whereas manual handling is really just conducting maneuver-based training. And so, what we find is that a robust upset prevention recovery training program, especially when it's integrated with scenario-based training, really does a great job of improving overall manual flight operation proficiency with respect to the pilot still being able to think and function and handle the airplane in a more aggressive maneuvering environment. Anybody have anything to add to that at all?
I think that everything that you said is true, BJ. It's just more true now after COVID. And that is because of the lack of proficiency. We had a simulator provider that visited us today, and he said that, he has a lot of people that have only flown 30 hours in the last year. And he's concerned about their proficiency, and we offered ourselves to his customers for people that he thought would benefit. They'll all benefit from upset prevention and recovery training, but some of them will benefit additionally by the manual handling and manual operations, aspects of UPRT.
All right. Well, we've had the clouds part and sunshine on aircraft training. Let's talk momentarily about some of the limitations of on-aircraft training, because there are some. And who would like to start on that? Well, again, we'll try to wrap up here in just a few minutes.
Well, I'll introduce probably the most important word, and that's transferability. The example that I always use is, if we're teaching people 8-point vertical rolls, it's not going to do them very much good in their 767. But if we're using the aircraft to show them how unloading to less than 1G reduces the angle of attack and can eliminate a stall or create a greater margin of safety, then that is 100% transferable. And so, that's the big thing, is making sure that instructors know how to use the platform. But they're a lot different, training aircraft in order to be able to provide some of the all attitude maneuvering that we want. But that's where the simulator can be used as a bridge to the operational aircraft.
Yeah, and a couple more of those on the right side, we see our list of criteria. For example, is very low altitude or all weather upsets you can't safely do in an airplane. A simulator is great at that. The freeze and study option as well, to help somebody understand what's going on. Something you can't do, for example, in a business jet training platform, or even either one of those either. And then we find a tremendous amount of benefit of doing CRM training in a more traditional side-by-side transport category cockpit to follow the SOPs or the operating procedure of the airline or the flight department we're working with, and of course, representative control, feel, and response. Janine, what would you add on limitations of on-aircraft training, or perhaps maybe some benefits of integration of simulation, however you'd like to approach it.
I think one limitation of on-aircraft training are the pilots that, I mean, I know you can break through sooner or later, but I think sometimes you'll come up with pilots that just have a hard time learning those situations of, you know, not knowing what to expect. Yeah, but I don't know that putting them in a simulator would help that much. But otherwise, I'm really trying to think of some limitations. The weather, yeah, I think that's, you know, sometimes you can't go fly because of the weather. But for this purpose, I don't think there's too many other limitations.
The only thing I would add, and Nick, you can jump in, is the fact that the ideal platform can be used completely inappropriately by an ineffective instructor. And you can really take an airplane that's ideally suited to upset prevention and recovery training, like our Extras or the Grove or S211, and really teach some dangerous stuff that doesn't transfer anywhere. So it really is in the hands of the instructor to make this entire implementation of mitigation of value. Nick, what do you have to say to wrap things up here tonight?
I would just add on to that to say is we know that 99.9% of all of our pilots' emergency maneuvering training has been in a redundantly safe airplane, likely below 10,000 feet, and the instructor for UPRT could easily teach some negative skill set. So stay within the operating envelope of your aircraft that we want to emulate, so that we aren't doing a jet trainer recovery in a transport airplane.
Anybody have anything else on why on-aircraft upset training is king to wrap things up? I think we made a fair amount of good points here today in our conversation. Randy?
There are some people that are sensitive to motion sickness, but again, a good instructor knows how to mitigate those things, and it's really far less than what the average folks fear before they come and do this training.
Our sales team is always about how fun it's going to be, and I'm like, okay, about 60% to 70% of people are going to have fun, 30% aren't, but every one of them is going to know it's life-saving training and the best thing they could have done with their time. Janine, wrap us up with some words of wisdom as we part here today.
I was going to throw in the fun part too. And, you know, I think if we define fun by going out and being safe so that we can come home and be with those that we wish to be with, I think then everybody has fun.
Yeah, and I think it's really all about the instructor as well. I know that a lot of people come to upset training being apprehensive, and the instructor's role is really a psychological one, to put people at ease, let them have their guards come down, let them realize that they're free to make mistakes, it's expected, and that's how we go through the learning process. So with that, let's wrap it up today. Thank you, everybody, for a great discussion and contributing, and we will leave it there, and we'll see everybody next week. Take care, everybody.